Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Larson said, I'm Jeff Shumway. I'm a professor in the history department. I also run the Latin American Studies program here. So we'd like to welcome you again to Kirk's class, Dr. Larson's class. But we're so happy to have Dr. Stephanie Smith here with us. But before I introduce her, I just want to call your attention to the photographs that are outside the hall here. We are just in the final stages of putting up an exhibit on the Braceros program, the program that brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to help during World War II. And this exhibit fits in very well with Dr. Smith's presentation because the photographers are two brothers who were refugees from the Spanish Civil War who came and took refuge in Mexico. So kind of fits well within this. They were also artists who came and were given safe haven in Mexico during hard times. So before also, we just like to have Dr. Smith kind of get to know the audience here. How many of you have spent time in Latin America? Any considerable time? Raise your hand. Okay, a few of you. How about Mexico? How many of you have spent considerable time in Mexico? How about in the Yucatán Peninsula? Okay, so I mean, we're getting closer. Her first book was on the Yucatán Peninsula, so she has a strong place in her heart for that. So anyway, we got Portuguese speakers. All right, we always have a good contingency of Portuguese speakers as well. All right. Well, there's your audience, Dr. Smith. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Smith. She is from Oklahoma originally, went to Oklahoma University where she got a bachelor's in fine art. She took one history class as an undergrad and didn't like it a whole lot. It's probably American history.
It was.
No, I'm just kidding. Not Latin American. I'm kidding, of course, sort of. She got a master's in fine arts at University of Oklahoma and then went to New York City where she worked as for an advertising agency during part of the day, and then in the afternoon and evening she was an artist. So she lived as an artist in New York City for a number of years. And then, as she put it, she realized she had to have a retirement plan. And so she went back to school and got her PhD in Latin American history at SUNY Stony Brook, where she studied with Barbara Weinstein. And then she got a job at Ohio State, where she's been for the last 15 years. And she was on the dissertation committee of one of our former students, Cameron Jones. So she has a little BYU connection already. And her first book, Gender in the Mexican Revolution, Yucatán and the Realities of Patriarchy, was published by UNC Press a few years ago. Her second book, The Power and Politics of Art in Postrevolutionary Mexico, is hot off the press. My modern Latin American history class is reading it this semester. And her next project is perhaps a narrative biography of Frida Kahlo. So with that brief introduction, let's give Dr. Stephanie Smith a hand.
You guys can see that, right? Good. Yeah, I didn't know if... Is that better? Okay. So thank you for having me here today. I have to say your campus is amazing. I was telling Jeff that I woke up this morning and opened up the windows, the blinds to my hotel room, and then the mountains were there. And I hadn't seen them last night because I came in at dark. It's so spectacular. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. So, all right. So in January 1942, Mexico's influential daily newspapers announced the strange news that Tina Modotti, the notorious Italian photographer, had died alone the previous evening in the back seat of a taxi on her way to the hospital. So the unusual details of Modotti's demise intrigued the city's population, much in the same way as her politics and beauty had during her time in Mexico, or this was from 1922 to 1930. Indeed, at the moment of her death, Modotti only recently had returned to Mexico, and this was in 1939 when she returned, after years of exile. Still, her period away failed to diminish popular fascination with Modotti, and avid Mexico City readers devoured the front page articles of her grim death with great interest. After all, sensational stories reported that even as she lay dying, the, quote, well-known photographer and political extremist carried a photo in her pocket of her former boyfriend, the Cuban revolutionary Julio Antonio Mella. So he was assassinated in 1929. And here you can see, this is Tina Modotti. We have a lot of photos of her today. So the paper also reported that Modotti experienced success, but then again it positioned her as a, quote, communist leader, although according to the newspaper, just right before she came back to Mexico, she gave up her leftist beliefs. Here we go. Oh, there we go. So let's go back. So here's another photo of her when she was a bit younger. So the newspaper reports surrounding Modotti's life and death reflect many of the key elements most crucial to the relationship between Modotti and Mexico's post-revolutionary state and transnational radical artists. For one, the newspaper accounts of Modotti's death stressed the photographer's popularity and the fact that she had been, quote, well known during her time in Mexico. Second, besides her personal life, the newspaper's accounts recognize Modotti's importance as a photographer, or at least that she had garnered some success during her time in Mexico. Now, third, Modotti was a woman of the world, a political player who had originally acted in Hollywood when she was really young. She moved to the Soviet Union. She fought in the Spanish Civil War, and ultimately she abandoned her photography when she lived in the Soviet Union because she wanted to devote her time fully to being the spread of international communism, basically. So lastly, and perhaps more importantly, Modotti's affiliation with Mexico's Communist Party, or the PCM, played center stage throughout the reports of her death, and also those written when she was alive as well. Certainly the 1917 Russian Revolution, followed by the birth of Mexico's Communist Party in November 1919, led to the emergence of political and ideological leftist movements throughout Mexico, Latin America, and really at this time around the world. For example, the muralist Diego Rivera first joined Mexico's Communist Party in 1922, and David Alfaro Siqueiros in 1923. Reflecting the growing influence of the party, members soon elected Rivera to the PCM's National Executive Committee, or their top committee, in April 1923. And soon afterwards, they also nominated Siqueiros for the Secretary of Trade Unions. In 1925, the artist also created the newspaper El Machete, which became the PCM's official propaganda organ. Importantly, at this point, the artists argued that little separation existed between the quality of their art and its political meanings. I like this photo. It's a picture. Here you can see, look, Diego Rivera when he was young, and he's surrounded by members of the Communist Party, the very early Communist Party. And that's in his studio with the puppets. There we go. Besides radical politics, during the post-revolutionary era in Mexico's, Mexico City also served as the nexus of important cultural movements. Following the years of the armed struggle of the Mexican Revolution, which was around like 1910 to 1920, officials linked the reconstruction of the country to the creation of an authentic Mexican national identity. For many, art represented the best path forward, and Mexico's leaders looked to culture as a powerful educational and nation-building tool in the struggle to unite a country that was fractured by this regional infighting during the Mexican Revolution. As the first director of the Ministry of Public Education, or the SEP, from 1921 to 1924, Jose Vasconcelos, who you can see here, and then he's on the left and Diego Rivera's to his right. So Vasconcelos well understood the impact of culture and the power of art to uplift the popular classes. Accordingly, art was to be accessible to the public, as large murals on government buildings or on posters on walls, much as in the Soviet Union, Mexico's artists argued for the importance of understandable images created for the benefit of the popular classes rather than traditional paintings owned by the bourgeois rich, for example, just for somebody's private use. So art blossomed during this era where culture was viewed as an important political tool, but given the international recognition of Mexico's really great artists, culture was also considered to be a national treasure as well. As an exceptional time in Mexico's history, Mexico radiated an exuberance that attracted women and men from all parts of the world. In response, creative folks from Europe, the US, Latin America moved to Mexico City to be part of this really great excitement, and also to escape the horrors of fascism, of course, during the 1930s and 1940s. After arriving in the country, these radical artists quickly assumed roles within Mexico's artistic and political organizations, and they also solidified friendships among other internationals and with their Mexican counterparts. This talk today considers the influence of these folks from different parts of the world and the ways they shaped the cultural environment in which Mexico's leftist artists operated. In addition to Mexico's artists, including Rivera, of course, Siqueiros, and Frida Kahlo, this presentation will consider the photographer Tina Modotti from Italy, the founder of the journal Mexican Folkways, Frances Paca Toor, and she was from the US, the printmaker Pablo Higgins, he was also from the US, and of course, the controversial arrival of Leon Trotsky from the Soviet Union. To analyze the impact of these radical artists on Mexico's history and culture, this talk today begins in the 1920s, and then we'll move forward throughout the next couple of decades. Now, of course, we'll only very briefly today touch upon these historical figures, but please feel free to ask any sort of follow-up questions you might have. So to begin, let's return back to Tina Modotti from the beginning of this talk. You guys recognize all these guys, right? Frida Kahlo, Siqueiros. So it was exactly this exciting political and artistic environment that first attracted Modotti to visit Mexico City in 1922 and then returned there in 1923. At this point, she arrived to Mexico with her boyfriend at the time, the very famous U.S. photographer Edward Weston, and his son as well. Although Weston and Modotti collaborated on a number of projects over the next couple of years, he soon returned back home with his son, not surprisingly, and they drifted apart. There were two basic reasons why they fell apart. One was that Modotti, over this time, grew increasingly attracted to these leftist politics, and the other was that she became very well known in her own right as a photographer. So just to give you an idea, this was Modotti when she was young in Hollywood, Edward Weston, and then she was his model, Weston's model. So after Weston left Mexico, Modotti lived a life divided between her love of photography and, of course, her growing interest in this radical politics. At this point in her career, Modotti also produced some of her most striking photographs that combined her passion for both artistic form and political meaning. So this is actually one of my very favorites. This is called Workers' Parade, taken in 1926, and it reveals a group of men's sombreros repeated throughout the photo's frame, almost in sort of an abstract manner, right? But the photograph clearly portrays the political potential of the crowd. We don't really know where they're going, we can't see their faces, but we know they're off, we think they're off to do something quite important. So in some ways, that men's traditional hats hint at sort of an authentic Mexican identity, but the men in workers' parades also suggest something much more that transcends time and location. And basically, I think what she's trying to get at here is the need for all workers to unite in a desire to create a better future. But she used to work sort of in an abstract manner before this, before she became more political. So it's kind of a nice combination of both. Whoops. So besides the worker, the male worker, Modotti also focused her lens on Mexico's indigenous women. And once again, I think she was able to display an aptitude that merged both artistic form and radical political implications. So on the right is Woman and Child, and this was taken a little later than Workers' Parade. It was in 1929. But we can see in this photograph as well, it's a pregnant woman carries her little baby who wraps his tiny arm around his mother's shoulder. So as with Workers' Parade, the viewers denied once again the face, the mother's face, but we still see that she very strongly grasps the little baby with her very sturdy arm. And again, it sort of suggests a certain timelessness. So as a poor indigenous woman, she stands proudly, representing both strength and beauty of form. So Modotti quickly made friends with other radical artists and writers from Mexico, but also those from other countries who lived in Mexico at the time. And one of her very best friends was the gifted folklorist and writer Frances Paca Toor, and you can see her on the left. So for many, Toor symbolized the very heart of Mexico City's cultural vortex. She knew everybody. And everybody knew her. And what she was most popular for was if anybody wanted to meet anybody at this time in Mexico City, she would introduce them. She maintained like a great number of friendships. I'll tell you her living situation in a second, but she really just delighted in bringing people together. Now, she was originally from the United States. She moved in 1922 to start classes at the university there in summer school, and very quickly she said she was never going to leave Mexico. Now, she's most famous for bringing people together, but also for the creation of her bilingual journal called Mexican Folkways, which you can see. You can see the DR, and this was a cover by Diego Rivera. He did a lot of the covers. Basically, the purpose of Mexican Folkways was to highlight Mexicans' indigenous population and Mexico's folk art. So Toor and Tina Modotti even lived together on the same, they lived in the different apartments, but on the fifth floor of the same building in Mexico City, and Mexican Folkways had an office on the first floor. And other artists we're going to talk about, or we may not have time to talk about, but lived on the same floor of the same building. So what was nice is that Toor was able to bring together these Mexican and transnational intellectuals, and a lot of them collaborated on Mexican Folkways. She first published the journal in June 1925, and throughout its existence until 1937, the Mexico City Journal included an impressive roster of Mexican and international intellectuals and artists, including, of course, Modotti and Rivera. So many of Mexican Folkways contributors, although not all of them, professed allegiance to Mexico's Communist Party. Toor was friends with them, but she herself wanted nothing to do with the party. So regardless of their political beliefs, many of the women involved with Mexican Folkways maintained especially close friendships during this time. Work carried over to play, and contributors also enjoyed lively parties where they wore colorful clothing and they discussed the political events of the day. So here you have the writer Anita Brenner, who we talked about was from the US. Here it's kind of interesting because on the left is the photo of her by Edward Weston, and on the right is the photo by Tina Modotti. So she lived in Mexico City at this time, and she kept this journal. It's a massive journal, so we're able to see a lot what happened through her diary. And she recorded like lots of the occasions of these parties. Included one was a dinner party hosted by Modotti, where she said, a quote, gang of people came, and Paca Toor was dressed in a beautiful Oaxacan costume. The painter Frida Kahlo often joined the women's lively get-togethers, and during this time, as you guys can see here, Tina Modotti and Frida Kahlo, Modotti on the left, Kahlo on the right, became very close friends as well. So at the same time that they became friends, they also became attracted to radical politics, although Frida said that she always was. So revealing her commitment to social change, Modotti joined the Mexican Communist Party in late 1927, and in 1928, Kahlo herself became official member of the party as well. Through Modotti in 1928, Kahlo also met the great passion of her life, and of course, that was Diego Rivera. Before Kahlo's devotion to Rivera consumed like virtually all of her time, the two women enjoyed getting together for various occasions. For example, Modotti would throw these wonderful parties. She would bring together her friends, including Kahlo and Toor. As Modotti wrote to Kahlo, and I quote, "Because tomorrow is my birthday, I have invited Paca to an Italian dinner that my brother promised to prepare. I would very much like it if you could come, and I beg you to ask your mommy to let you. After dinner, we will accompany you to your home, or if you prefer, you can stay here." So Rivera illustrated Kahlo's and Modotti's commitment to communist ideology, or perhaps more appropriately, his gendered vision, by portraying both women in the mural series in the Ministry of Public Education building. So here you can see, this is in the third floor. It's the Arsenal panel, completed in 1928. So as you can see, Rivera painted Frida Kahlo in the middle. Here we have Tina Modotti, and then right here is that the boyfriend, Julio Antonio Mella, that I told you that she had the photograph in her pocket when she died. So they're both dressed in red shirts, which of course symbolizes that they were communist. Frida has the red star, and Mella was the Cuban revolutionary and her boyfriend at the time. So basically what Tina Modotti is doing is holding the bandolier and looking up lovingly to Mella. A worker proudly displays, as you guys can see, the red flag emblazoned with a hammer and sickle at the top of the mural. And both women appear attentive to the popular classes who surround them. And indeed, I would argue that the role appears to be as able assistants, even if they're portrayed as communists, rather than soldiers in their own right. So in this manner, Rivera positioned women as literal and symbolic helpers of the communist revolution. So it's a striking reflection of Rivera's assumptions for his roles for his future wife after he would marry her in 1929. Besides her friendships in photography, Modotti also devoted increasing amounts of time to the PCM-related activities. The same year that Modotti joined the Mexican Communist Party, 1927, she also met that same guy we just talked about, Julio Antonio Mella, the man in Rivera's mural. So they quickly fell in love, and they spent every second together. As I mentioned, he was a Cuban revolutionary who had to escape from Cuba to live in Mexico at this time. And they were together until his very mysterious death from a gunshot wound on the street corner one night after he and Modotti left a meeting together. Almost immediately, police considered Modotti to be the prime suspect in her lover's murder, and the very next day, the police arrested her and questioned her for hours before releasing her. So during the months that followed Mella's death, concerns around Modotti's radical political affiliations grew, as you could imagine, and government agents, both in Mexico and abroad, and in Italy too, closely monitored her movements. Indeed, internal security officials considered Modotti dangerous, enough to list her with other high-level communists in Mexico, including Siqueiros. To provide shelter from this constant harassment, she knew she was being followed. Modotti now limited her friends just to fellow PCM members, and mostly these artists connected with the PCM. Now, Modotti's house guest at the time was a woman named Eon Robinson, and you can see her up there. She kept a very interesting diary, too. And what she wrote her mother is, and I quote, "A constant stream of people is coming to see Tina. Writers, musicians, and painters who wear overalls with the red star pinned on the front. Everyone is a communist. It is evident that one must take sides in Mexico, and the sides the painters are on is red." That's a photo she took of Tina Modotti right there. So despite the political turmoil, Modotti finally had her first show of photographs at Mexico's great university, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM. So this was organized by Paca Toor and her other friends. But Modotti, though, knew her time was short. And this was especially the case because by 1929, the Mexican government took a very sharp turn to the right as conservatives expressed grave concerns with the growth of communism, both in Mexico and, of course, internationally as well. In response, in 1929, the Mexican government repressed the PCM. They would outlaw it soon afterwards. And in June of the same year, they also closed El Machete, that newspaper, and destroyed the presses. Now, El Machete was able to continue to operate, but it had to go underground. So this is Modotti's arrest photograph. I found this in the National Archives in Mexico. I was flipping through one day and just documents, and I couldn't believe what I saw. So on February 7th, 1930, under a false premise, Modotti was arrested for her supposed involvement in an attack on the president at the time. In his report to Mexico's Secretary of State, Mexico City's chief of police wrote, and I quote, "Detailed investigations that have been practiced by this police headquarters have found fully that Tina Modotti developed a work that was frankly corrosive and did not correspond to the hospitality that we protect in our country, and in my opinion, should be considered an evil foreigner." In other words, as a radical foreigner, Modotti was now considered dangerous and expelled from the country. So she would stop in Berlin for a brief spell before she went on to the Soviet Union, and it's at this point that she gave up her photography to focus completely on politics. She also participated in the Spanish Civil War, and then she finally returned in 1939, as we spoke about at the beginning of our talk. Now, there's a lot of question whether she really was sad about giving up her photography, and I'm not sure. Here's some more photographs that she's really quite famous for. The sombrero with a hammer and sickle, and the workers' hands, the weathered hands, and then, of course, the woman with the flag. In the 1930s, the fascist terror added an additional dimension for the artists, writers, and intellectuals who arrived in Mexico City from wide-ranging parts of the world. Not only did they travel to Mexico City to join the country's growing cultural movement, but they also sought safety from the horrors of fascism. The influx of refugees from the Spanish Civil War, along with artists and intellectuals from France, Germany, and other parts of Europe, transformed Mexico City into a vibrant center of anti-fascist resistance. While living and working in Mexico's capital, transplanted activists participated in debates on art, its place in revolution, and the appropriate style that would reach the greatest number of people. Through their arts and writings, they contributed significantly to the emergence of artistic movements, as well as the creation of a post-revolutionary national identity. So two artists, organizations, played particularly noteworthy roles in the fight against fascism. One is the League of Revolutionary Writers and Artists, or LEAR, that was established in early 1934, and the immensely influential Popular Graphics Arts Workshop, or the TGP, and that was established in 1937 by former LEAR members, which we'll talk about in a second. So after their arrival to Mexico, these international artists joined the LEAR and then the TGP and participated in the production of particularly powerful posters, as you guys can see here, and prints with images that directly challenged and warned of the violence of fascism. Among Siqueiros and other artists, Pablo Higgins was a founding member of LEAR. From the beginning, LEAR closely aligned with Mexico's Communist Party, especially since its leadership and all of its members belonged to the PCM. So the LEAR didn't force its members to belong, but I went through all of its membership, and I could only find one member who wasn't a member of the party. So O'Higgins, originally from the U.S., arrived in Mexico in 1924, and within 6 months he began working as Diego Rivera's assistant on the murals that we saw in the Secretary of Education building. By 1927, the PCM accepted O'Higgins in their ranks, and he would remain loyal to the PCM for 20 years, and he became, at that point, very disillusioned and then left. O'Higgins and Lear members remained active by offering lectures, art exhibitions, and especially through their creation of this journal, as you guys can see, Frente a Frente. Importantly, and partly based on the organization's ties to the PCM, at first Lear members maintained a fiercely critical stance toward the Mexican government. But during the mid-1935 and into the summer of 1936, Lear members transitioned from one that criticized the government to a position that supported the government and backed the new president. At this time was President Lázaro Cárdenas. He's president from 1934 to 1940. So supporting the Communist International endorsement of the Popular Front in August 1935 to fight against the growing fascist threat, the Lear artists and the PCM members now promoted greater alliance with Cárdenas in the mass organizations. So in other words, the radical artists decided that they would work as one with the government at this point. So as the Lear artists softened their formerly sharp political edge to focus instead on the greater needs of the Mexican nation and to fight against global fascism, not surprisingly, arguments developed over Lear's future direction, and eventually this led to Lear falling apart. It was sometime in late 1937 or early 1938. So a number of reasons precipitated Lear's demise and the creation of the TGP, which now the TGP focused largely on printmaking. So according to the TGP founders, though, they mainly created this new group out of frustration over Lear's ideological shift. In other words, they didn't agree with it, and they didn't agree with the willingness of the group to align with the government. So here you can see one of their famous posters. Leopoldo Mendez, who did that previous poster, was one of Lear's founders, later described Lear's demise in harsh terms, and I'll quote you here. Lear died of the worst disease, opportunism, but some of us didn't want to attend Lear's funeral, and we founded the TGP. As Mendez illustrated with his funeral analogy, this group of artists ultimately resurrected this initial excitement and political dedication of Lear in its early days, and from this point forward, they created some of the most magnificent art in Mexico's history. It's mostly, like I said, it's woodcuts, lithographs, and prints of all kinds, but it's just incredible. Like this. So, not surprisingly, not all political exiles were welcome equally to Mexico. And without doubt, Leon Trotsky's early 1937 arrival to Mexico represented one of the country's most controversial refugees. Trotsky's short years in Mexico ripped apart the fragile political fabric that initially united the artists involved in Mexico's Communist Party. By the end of the 1920s and throughout the 1930s, Mexico's artists split. So they split in two. So those who would back Stalin, most importantly Siqueiros, and Trotsky supporters, and this would be led by Rivera. Here you can see their arrival to Mexico. In Mexico, Rivera's direct involvement in the Trotsky situation began after Anita Brenner, acting on behalf of the U.S. Committee for Asylum for Trotsky, sent Rivera a telegram towards the end of November 1936 asking to intervene in a life and death matter of providing Trotsky asylum in Mexico. Expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, Trotsky had lived a nomadic life first in Turkey, France, and finally Norway for the next few years. However, after facing pressure from the Soviet Union and then conservatives within Norway as well, Norwegian officials placed the former revolutionary under house arrest in, it was like late August, early September 1936. And they said if he didn't find a place to get out, if he didn't leave, that they would send him back to Soviet Union, of course, where he would face certain death. So Rivera responded quickly and successfully by contacting high-level political officials, including Mexico's President Cárdenas, for help. And I do have to say, this is remarkable that an artist in Mexico could literally reach out to the president and say, can you do this? When no other country would accept Trotsky at the time. Now, it's interesting because Rivera will take all the credit. So it wasn't all his doing, but he did a lot, actually. In January 9th, 1937, Trotsky and his wife, Natalia, arrived safely to Mexico. So immediately once they stepped foot on Mexican soil, Trotsky assured the host government that he would comply with the wishes of the president and others not to interfere in national politics. Trotsky's involvement promise proved to be an empty one, of course. It was impossible, as his very presence within the country polarized Mexico's politics and immediately sparked a firestorm of controversy among the artistic community, and really all over Mexico as well. So Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera offered the couple the use of the Kahlo family home in Coyoacan, that's a suburb of Mexico City, and Trotsky and his wife and various assistants moved in on January 11th. As Trotsky described his experience, he said, and I quote, "We arrived at a low house painted blue. We had come to a different world, the house of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera." And here you can see the blue house. Trotsky with his rabbits. He had rabbit hutches. He loved rabbits. So Rivera facilitated Trotsky's existence in Mexico, but within a few short months of his arrival, the muralist relationship with exiled Russians soured over a number of issues. According to the painter, their differences of opinions seemed virtually impassable from practically their very first conversations. According to Rivera, Trotsky disagreed with the painter's assessment of a relatively small political issue, and this is what he said. Trotsky said to Rivera, and I quote, "Your response is stupid. Your views are completely out of place. You're a very talented painter, but in politics, a completely childish character." Not surprisingly, they moved out of the Kahlo house and moved to this new house. It's literally just down the block, though. So soon after his disagreement with Rivera in March 1939, Trotsky moved out of this blue house, and then he moved into the new home. So although a number of teams, including Trotsky's personal guards and the local police, patrolled the perimeter of the blue house from the very first day that Trotsky arrived in Mexico, the security measures, and especially in this new house, were dismal at the very best. In response to potential dire threats from within and outside of Mexico, by the end of November 1939, Trotsky and his assistants issued intricate orders in the hopes of improving security, but clearly they were not able to do so. This is a map I found. This was taken right after the attack. I found it in the AGN, right after the attack. The police drew it to illustrate what happened, what I'm going to tell you about. So by early 1939, Soviet plans to eliminate their greatest enemy began to solidify as a number of operatives arrived in Mexico City to carry out Trotsky's assassination. Ironically, though, none other than the country's most illustrious painter, Siqueiros, would assume the leading role in one of the principal groups to rid the country of its notorious exile. As an avowed enemy of Trotsky and elevating direct action over words and even the paintbrush, Siqueiros willingly devoted himself to the task at hand after being contacted by representatives of the Soviet secret police in Mexico. So Siqueiros later remarked that he and a small group of anti-Trotsky comrades asked themselves if they could, quote, permit Trotsky to continue in Mexico, protected by the government, in which they said, no, we can no longer allow this, quote, disgrace to continue. So united in their objective to eliminate their enemy, Siqueiros, who at this point had attained experience in fighting during the Spanish Civil War, and his cohort of other artists, agreed that the time had come to launch an attack against Trotsky and the Trotsky compound. So you guys can see here, that's the bullet hole. So they've kept his bedroom exactly the way it was after this attack. You can visit it today. So a Trotsky's account to the authorities immediately following the assault on his home provides an intriguing narrative of the events that took place. Although at this point, Siqueiros' involvement remained unknown, so they didn't know until later. So around 4 in the morning on May 24th, 1940, Trotsky awoke to the sound of gunfire that at first he thought was firecrackers. But because the explosion sounded so close, and as the room filled with the pervasive smell of gunpowder, Trotsky and his wife soon understood the dire reality of this long-feared attack. At the sound of the first shots, Trotsky's wife jumped out of bed, and her husband soon followed, sliding to the ground in the place between the wall and the bed. So to the side, like that would be like on your left there. Trotsky's wife later recalled that she could clearly see the flashes of the guns, although she couldn't see the gunmen's faces because they were obscured by the dark. So when questioned later about the near impossibility of surviving this offensive, Trotsky speculated that the attackers possibly shot either too high or too low in their excitement or because they were trying to avoid killing each other. But he also said that basically they survived because of his ability to stay calm, not get excited, and basically play dead behind the bed. After the initial attempt on his life, Trotsky lamented, and I quote, "Fate has granted me a reprieve, but it will be of short duration." And indeed, of course, it was. So Trotsky foretold his future. For less than 3 months later, on August 21st, he died from the blow to the skull with a pickaxe. So police later arrested a Soviet operative who killed Trotsky with the inadvertent help of his girlfriend. His girlfriend was an avid Trotsky supporter, so he was able to enter into the compound with her help. And she was devastated, obviously. So soon afterwards, police also arrested Siqueiros for his role in the first attack, of course. So he spent several months in jail, and eventually the court, it was the judge, acquitted him of directing the successful machine gun attack on Trotsky's compound earlier in May, and he was kicked out of the country. When one of the, I love this phrase I'm going to tell you. So when one of the guards who accompanied Siqueiros from the cell on his way to freedom asked the painter about his future plans, he replied to paint. The same guard then asked Siqueiros if he would leave politics. So listen to this. To which his wife at the time answered, before he even had a chance to say anything, "Forever. To paint, that's what makes it great." In other words, he needs to stay out of politics. So in conclusion, the legacies left by the transnational radical politics offers much to those who study art in post-revolutionary Mexico. Easily traversing national borders, both in geographical space and with their friendships as well, their history also provides an example of boldness in moments of great political excitement, but as we saw also in great turmoil. That's Siqueiros later in prison, of course. An analysis of the influence of the transnational radical artist, however, further reveals the artist's contribution to the creation of Mexico's national identity, especially in the years following the Mexican Revolution. Today, we only covered just a few of the leading historical figures, but through their photographs, journals, prints, and even their politics, as we saw with Trotsky, these transnational artists and intellectuals significantly shaped concepts of an authentic Mexico and impacted Mexico's future in countless ways to come. Thank you.
We have time for at least a few questions. We ask if you want to ask a question that you come and use the microphone here on the left for the benefit of our listening and recording audience. And if you are a BYU student, tell us who you are and what you're studying.
Yes. No. I know, I teach at Ohio State, so. I'm used to questions.
Hi, Jeff Hardy from the History Department. I study the Soviet Union.
Oh.
Just one question. So you've got this international group of intellectuals and artists here centered in Mexico City discussing politics, doing art, but you also talk about a national identity. So what is the level of debate then concerning a national identity that's created by non-Mexicans? To what extent is that discussed?
That's a great question. In fact, I was just thinking about that question the other day when I was thinking about this talk. So I think for instance, if we think of Modotti, she was very aware of what she was doing. So she was aware when she was creating like the hammer and sickle painting, photographs, that she was contributing at least somewhat of her version of what Mexico should be, if that makes sense. So as a national identity, I would argue it's like, at this time, a conception of how Mexico should conceive its future and how Mexico could also conceive of its past. So in this way, she was actually making what she thought was her contribution to a national identity. Now, I would agree maybe somewhat with your question. I think what you're leading to is how much at the time were they cognizant of that fact. And I would think it's one of those things that we can look back later and say that it's much more relevant in the future looking backwards, if that makes sense, you know. So they definitely came together. They definitely had this conversation of what Mexico should be. And then they were also very aware, too, of how to portray this concept of a Mexico on walls, on posters. But I think it becomes more relevant looking back. I always think it's very interesting, too, like, say, if we take Modotti, basically her photographs went for nothing, you know. And so if we think of a national identity today, her photographs go for, $100,000 or something, you know. So yes, they were aware of it, but they also like to play a lot too, if that makes sense. So it was both a combination of politics and also having a great time doing their art too. Does that answer your question? No other? You have one?
I was just wondering if you could speak to indigenismo in Mexico at this time of the creation of Mexico's national identity and keying into the indigenous past, and whether or not that also related to policies which helped advocate for indigenous populations, or if it was more exploitative.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're going to talk about that in Professor Shumway's class tomorrow as well. So it's interesting because, you guys saw, I don't know if I included, I don't think I included in the PowerPoint for tomorrow. Diego Rivera, of course, painted a lot of paintings, and a lot of the artists did at this particular time, especially in the early 1920s, of their idealized version of an indigenous population. And it was interesting because at first, the Secretary of Education, Vasconcelos, insisted that they paint these images of like women, indigenous women with their hair, beautifully done in braids and carrying flowers. But I do have to say it's ironic because at the very same time that he was promoting the sort of indigenous image, Vasconcelos was in the countryside saying that the indigenous population had to give up their languages. And basically he was sending the teachers into the countryside because he said, well, you can't create a coherent post-revolutionary identity with everybody having different beliefs and different languages. So he was very disliked. The teachers were very disliked at the same time. That he was promoting this sort of idealized national identity. But I do have to say the other thing that's sort of unusual was that they used the same model. And her name was Luz Jimenez. And Tina Modotti used her, Diego Rivera used her. So basically the image that we see of like indigenous woman, oftentimes like with indigenous woman with a child, was the same woman used over and over and over again. So it's like one image. Does that make sense? So it's ironic, the same time, to answer your question, the same time they're putting forward this beautiful image, at the same time they're doing that, they're, basically trying to let's just say sort of, I wouldn't say wipe out, but basically create one identity that certainly wasn't one of the indigenous population. Thank you. You're welcome. By the way, Vasconcelos would change later, and then he would want to get rid of the indigenous paintings, and he switched to more modernism. So that lasted just for a very short period of time.
Hi,
Hi.
Zach Chase, and I'd just like to announce for the record, I am not now, nor have I ever been a BYU student.
I thought you,
I'm
of
in
course.
I'm in the anthropology department.
Oh.
You speak a little bit about this in some places in the book. I was just wondering if you could speak to us briefly about any knowledge of national and international intelligence agencies' involvement with or possible underpinning even of some of the folklore journal, for example, the Folkways journal, or any of these
well,
products. So you speak about culture frequently in the
Yeah.
book, and it's a very specific
Yeah.
definition of culture in political activist terms and sort of a high culture or a political culture sense. Do you have any information about what agencies may be or may not be involved in advancing these things?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So as far as Mexican Folkways, it was subsidized by the Mexican government, but it went through periods where the government had money and would give it to them, and then periods where they got mad at them, and then they wouldn't. Exactly. So eventually, and it would also depend on who was in power, which president was in power. So for instance, at the very beginning, the Mexican government paid for Mexican Folkways. They subsidized it, at least partly. But not the U.S. Now, the U.S. was involved in Mexican Folkways because it did have U.S. subscribers. So, because it was bilingual. You know, one side was Spanish, one side was English.
Did she retain her U.S. citizenship?
Yes, she did. Yeah, so, yeah, it's interesting. So she always did, but she ended up not staying in Mexico forever. She traveled basically to Italy and the world. But as far as sort of international organizations, what I found striking was this sort of what we call like internal security agents, and how remarkably involved they were in the lives of these artists. And it wasn't only in Mexico, but it was also, of course, in the U.S., you know, with the fear of communism, but also in Italy. So I found these files, in the police files on Tina Modotti, and they were following her every move in Italy, but from Italy in the U.S. So, you know, so it's definitely fascinating to me, this sort of international component that was involved. But as far as I know, I never found the sort of U.S. Monies going to Mexican Folkways. You're welcome. Yeah.
Marlene Esplin, Humanities, and my question for you is, to what extent do you think the transnational contours of some of these figures' biographies have contributed to their relative neglect in either kind of Latin American history departments or sort of firmly sort of U.S.-based history departments?
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure, you know, if it has much to do with their transnational standing. I mean, can I ask you what you think?
It's a question. I don't know.
I mean, I mean,
I feel like we know,
yeah,
Grandes, and we know Frida Kahlo.
I know.
Those who kind of fit firmly into sort of linguistic
Yeah.
positions, but maybe these figures are on the outside.
So it's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer to it. So I say that because I started this project because I was interested in the artist because of my artist background. And I actually didn't really have, I knew like anybody would who reads about Frida Kahlo or Diego Rivera, just, you know, in the books that, oh, he joined the Communist Party or whatever. You know, it just is like a throwaway line. But then when I started looking through these documents, like I looked through documents in 5 different countries for this book, it shocked me that they were key elements in the party. Now they get kicked out, of course, and they come back. You know, it's a relationship fraught with a lot of difficulties. But that's what I think. For me, I just could not believe that here we have this whole history that nobody ever talks about, or they don't want to talk about, or whatever. So as far as these artists, I'm myself kind of curious why there isn't more written about them. You know, I think it's fascinating material. So for instance, there's like 1 or 2 books about Trotsky in Mexico. You know, but there really isn't that much. And it's like this crazy time. Or we have a lot of Frida Kahlo books, obviously, but they're written from an art historian point of view, or sort of, there's like a few biographies, but they're more popular biographies. But there's not really any that dig deep into the lives of these artists. I have a friend who Professor Shumway knows as well, who's interested in writing a biography on Diego Rivera for this exact same reason, because there's just no like deep historical analysis of their work, this light biography or brilliant art histories about them. So I think that as far as the transnational element, I think that plays into it, but I don't think that's the only reason. But I don't know exactly why more study hasn't been devoted to these artists. It seems like it should be now. You're welcome.